Hello, everybody. My name is Benjamin Day,
And I am Jillian Mason.
and this is Medicare for All, the podcast for everybody who needs health care. To our listeners out there who are parents, this will come as no surprise, but when our kids turn 2 or 3 years old, they learn to tell what is called a primary lie. That means they lie without much sophistication or really like awareness of how the listener is perceiving the lie. Hint, you completely failed to fool your parents your whole childhood.
So
But
this is like when my sister came home and told my parents, she came home with a big chunk of her hair cut out, and she told my parents that the school hair cutter had done it. Like
yeah,
that would
that's
be that
about,
level of
yes.
awareness.
I hope she wasn't older than 2 or 3, because at age 4, Jillian, we learn to tell secondary lies, which takes into account the listener's likely reaction, and our lies become a little more plausible. But then when we turn 7 or 8, we learn to tell tertiary lies, where we also make sure that our lie is consistent with, other surrounding facts. But I say all this to tell you that not until you've asked your legislator to support Medicare for all have you experienced the apex of deception. You probably walk out of that meeting knowing that they didn't agree with you, but you're not sure if they disagree with you or whether you've learned anything about their position on the issue. This is probably not unique to Medicare for All. But today we are here to talk about what we call legislative pushback or evasion or avoidance, basically like the whole playbook of tactics that legislators employ to land somewhere between yes and no. So, Jillian, do you want to introduce our phenomenal guests?
Do I ever? So we have two of our favorite bros here today. We've got Egan Kemp, and Egan is a healthcare policy advocate and public citizen. Egan's an expert in healthcare policy, including single payer systems, what we call Medicare for All. And he previously served as a senior policy analyst for the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which I don't know if that really exists. That might be an illusion, but you can talk about that later. And then we also have Vinay. Vinay Krishnan is the national field organizer for the Center for Popular Democracy, and we actually just learned a bunch of interesting things today by looking at Vinay's website. We know him as an organizer, but actually he is also a writer of fiction and nonfiction, and also an attorney based in Brooklyn, New York. So fiction, nonfiction, attorney, lots of experience with lies. But so before we launch into our guests, and welcome bros, we love you. But before we get into that, we just want to kind of set the stage here and kind of explain the context for why we wanted to specifically talk about the about legislative pushback today. Ben, do you want to just tell them about what we're working on right now at Healthcare Now?
Yes. So it is 2023. That means a new legislative session has started. And that means that both of the Medicare for All bills in the House and in the Senate have to be refiled. And every single legislator in both chambers has to be reapproached or approached for the first time to get on board the bill. Even legislators you think have supported the bill in the past and you're pretty sure you can get back on, it can actually take quite a bit of work to get them back on. Now, we don't know exactly when the two bills are going to be introduced. We're hoping maybe May-ish. We think June at the latest for the House bill. But we don't want to wait. We don't want to like squander the first 4 to 5 months of the year waiting for the bills to be dropped. So both CPD and Public Citizen and Healthcare Now and our whole national coalition of organizations, we're asking all of our members and our activists to start right away by lobbying and calling up their legislators. This doesn't have to be a huge organizing activity yet. You don't have to build a giant coalition if you don't have one already. Just as yourself, call up their office and try to get a hold of their healthcare aide and see if they are intending to co-sponsor the bill this session, or if you can get any information whatsoever about where they stand on the issue. So Jillian has pulled together an amazing guide to do this.
It is amazing, isn't
it? All right. So I'm actually putting it on screen here, the link, healthcare-now.org/make the call. And this will walk you
Listening to the audio version, it'll be in the show notes.
exactly. It will make you walk you step by step through. Thank you for reminding me we're a podcast, Jillian. If you are not seeing it on screen, it will be in the show notes. So anyway, this guide will walk you like step by step, just how to call your legislator, all the resources you need, and then there's a feedback form to tell us what they say. So now that we have you doing this, we want to prepare you for the worst.
Yes. And I mean, it's always good to be prepared for the worst. Speaking of the worst, right? So most of our supporters here are regular people with, who go about their ordinary lives, don't have any lobbying experience. And so maybe making this call to their legislator to ask them to support Medicare for all is the first time they've ever done this. But you guys, you do this every day. So you want to just kind of like sum up for us, what is it like dealing with legislators trying to sell them these progressive issues when they may be a little reluctant every day? Vinay, how do you spend your days? How do you get through it all?
Well, luckily for me, I don't know how true this is for Egan, but luckily for me, it's a mix of talking to legislators and their staffers and aides and all that sort of thing, which isn't the most fun part of the mix. But I also get to organize people who are directly impacted by our healthcare system, and talk them through, how to tell your healthcare story, how to be vulnerable. And some of these people are talking about some of the most difficult, parts of their lives, which are still ongoing. And I get to connect with them on that level and talk through, people who are paying too much for prescription medication so they can't pay rent, or they're choosing between, a procedure for themselves or a procedure for their children, or they're rationing their insulin, that sort of thing. So most of my time is spent doing that direct organizing work with CPD's affiliates across the country. And it's incredibly, but then of course you bring them to the legislators, and then you have to have, a lot of these conversations we're talking about today, which involves, lots of headaches and disappointments and talking to people who, like, you can tell they know they should be doing better, but often aren't. It's a mix of very inspiring moments and disappointing moments, and I'm sure we'll unpack it all today.
Yeah. Sounds good. Sounds good.
And I, on the other hand, do spend most of my time on sort of talking to Hill folks, which
poor soul
can be as bad as it sounds. I think the saving grace is that you do also have champions and allies and staffers that work for those offices that really sort of strategize with you and help you push for progressive policies. My sort of day to day when it comes to, especially right before the launch of a Medicare for All bill, is really tracking down every health staffer, every legislative director, every chief of staff that it makes sense to really push them on the issue. And sort of different offices are more open and willing to have, the conversations and to answer questions and to even ask questions. But yeah, it can vary pretty widely.
All right.
I kind of imagine you like running up and down the hill all day, just like maybe putting on some sneakers.
I've seen him do that.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Running suicides. All right. Well, speaking of variance in what you get back from legislators, this is basically what we want to do in this episode, is to prepare people for the very likely case that they might not get a yes or a no from their legislators or their aides, but some weird form of evasion in the middle, and how we kind of respond to that, or, distinguish between evasion and maybe legitimate concerns that an office might have. So we thought, being calm, rational people approaching this on our podcast, which is a very, very serious place, we would ask both of you, what is your absolute wildest story that of a legislator providing some sort of pushback? Vinay, did you want to start?
Sure. This is wild in like a thoroughly insulting, stigmatizing, disappointing way. So I'll just give a little trigger warning there. But yeah, so of course, like when we're bringing people to lobby visits or bird dogging, we're encouraging them to tell, very, very personal, difficult stories. Right. And we were in a lobby visit. I don't remember the name of the senator, which is maybe a good thing right now. Right. So it means I'll get in less trouble. But we were in the office asking for, expansion to a particular healthcare bill. and it was particularly focused on mental health and people who were telling mental health stories. And as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of these staffers don't quite have a firm grasp on how mental health works. And so a person talked about being suicidal and surviving a suicide attempt, and just not having access to, the medical care that they needed, and told a whole very very moving stories, I'm sure you can imagine. And the ask was, obviously we're asking them to support a certain bill. And the staffer, this is the person who leads the healthcare for the senator. And if you search in my Twitter history, you can probably figure out who it was, because I remember putting them on blast after.
Right.
But they basically responded to me and to this person who just told the story that suicide is a mystery and it's completely not preventable. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. They talked about it as if it were like some, problem in like a Tolkien book or something. Like, oh, I wish we could do something, but there's just no one's found a way to prevent people from committing suicide.
Wow.
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to curse on here, so I won't. But yeah, I mean, we were like, well, I could think of like 10 things off the top of my head that could help. Like, one is this bill, which will increase
Right.
mental health services, access to it, transportation to it,
Right.
decreasing stigma, like the stigma that you're saying right now, decreasing that would help. Also like housing and, unemployment benefits. There's so many things that could put people and give people the security and stability they need to keep themselves safe. But yeah, he said that to our faces, and like people were angry. People were like so upset. So I don't know if hopefully I'll think of some more fun stories later, but that's the first one that came to mind.
Yeah, let's work on the fun story. No, I'm just kidding. That is like, I really love like the, like really, we were talking before this, one of my friends, Tanya in Massachusetts, she had spoken in 2019 to the chief of staff from Stephen Lynch's office. I've been given permission to just call him right out. So the chief of staff from Stephen Lynch's office, and he literally said to this group of women who were lobbying him, ladies, you don't understand how things work. And I do think that's actually a strategy. You say something really inflammatory, and all of a sudden, no one's thinking about Medicare for all. They're just thinking about what a dick this guy is.
Right.
But I don't know. Egan, I've bought you some time to think of a great story.
Yeah, I feel like I probably get the more mundane end of things, which is staffers that are, have been asked a million times. They're tired of hearing from Medicare for all people, and they just want me to sort of stop talking or get out of their office. And I think that the important thing for me is sort of, leaving the door open, even when I can tell that they don't want the door open, and then, coming up with ways to sort of push through it. It sounds like that's what we're going to focus on, sort of in the more specific areas. But I feel like the worst answer what I often get is that their boss can't support because they haven't looked at the bill.
Right.
And it's sort of like the bills haven't changed that much in recent years. And so if your boss hasn't looked, that's just laziness, or they don't want to see what's in there because they might like some things. And this way, even though, they've had years to look at it, they just have refused to.
All right. This is a great segue because I tried to pull together a few categories of like evasion and pushback just to so people can prepare themselves when they're going in. That you're very likely to hear these. As soon as I heard Vinay's story, I realized I missed a category, which is denying the existence of the problem, or just like total denial, or mansplaining might be another whole category. But I thought I would start. So one thing one category that I've experienced a bunch of times, and both at the state legislature and congressional level. And I wanted to, maybe I'll run this one by you, Egan, first, which is downplaying kind of the importance of co-sponsoring. Is this one that you've run into at all? And what do you feel about this category of excuse?
Yeah, I think it's a frequent one, and it's one that I think is worth taking some time to think about, because you'll often hear like, oh, Medicare for all is just a slogan, so I don't really need to engage, or the bill is not detailed enough, like it would have to really be fleshed out, or I'm not on a committee of jurisdiction, or I'm in leadership. All these sort of more technical things, reasons that they can sort of justify. Well, if it was going to happen, I'd be more willing to engage, or if something was was moving, I might jump on board. And so they can sort of stay in that space between yes and no, that it's sort of like, oh, I might say yes, or I
Mhm.
might say no, but I'm not going to get into it at this point.
And how?
What
Yeah,
what
go
about
ahead,
that?
Jen.
I just wanted to ask, what about that? This is one of my favorites. I'm in leadership. You mentioned this. I'm in leadership, so I
Yeah.
don't co-sponsor bills like that. If that phrase does not capture the cognitive disconnect that is our legislature,
Right. Real leadership comes for not supporting anything, right?
I'm a leader, so I don't make my views known. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I would say it also goes along with one of the other ones I hear commonly, which they're very contradictory. Is someone will say, I'm on a committee of jurisdiction and so I can't co-sponsor, or I'm not on a committee of jurisdiction so I can't co-sponsor. And so it's like this weird thing. And I found sort of the best way to respond is sort of to help them understand why it's still important and why it's important to their constituents. So one of the things that we do is we work on Medicare for All resolutions. We have a website, Medicare for the number for all resolutions.org. And that one really gives, when you're pulling people together to work on a resolution, you get a whole bunch of different stories. And so even if a locality hasn't passed a resolution and they're just working on it, you can often come to the legislator with stories, like it may not feel like the most pressing because you don't see that there's going to be a vote on it, immediately, but here's why it's important to your constituents. And sometimes that can help break down some of those initial barriers and have a more, thorough conversation.
Right. And this is going to be a theme for this podcast. We don't want to give people the impression that like when your legislator gives an evasive answer or one of their aides that you need to have like the right answer to get them on board the bill eventually. Your answer doesn't matter that much. What matters far more is building real capacity and power in the district. That means passing municipal resolutions like Egan's talking about and public citizen focus about. This is about building networks of affected patients like Vinay was talking about, actually bringing them to their legislators and telling their stories. So especially if it's just you or a few people and you're like the usual suspects who get written off, the real answer to all of these is to bring more people next time, right? And bring more institutions, bring more organizations, and not to filibuster this one category, Egan, but I find that one type of pushback that our folks have the hardest time with is when a legislator says, yes, I support Medicare for all, but I'm not going to co-sponsor. They often will say, I would vote for it if it came up for a vote, but I'm not going to co-sponsor the bill. How do you wrap your head around that?
Yeah, that's an important one because you will hear that frequently, or somebody ran on it, and then once they're in office, all of a sudden you're fighting them to get onto the bill that they said they supported and ran on. Right. And an important one for them is I would say consistent follow up with that office. That's sort of where I go to there, and then sort of giving them a chance to either ask any questions if that's where a holdup is, or just so that they continually feel the pressure on it, and emphasizing to them why it's so important to have as many co-sponsors as we can. That it's sort of, if we're building towards a vote, if we're going to get a vote in a certain session, it's really going to be a matter of having a certain number of co-sponsors, having enough of the caucus, enough of people in different caucuses, whether it's Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, engaged on the issue.
Right. So the claim that co-sponsorship doesn't matter, which comes from a lot of legislative offices, they probably know is false. Co-sponsorship does matter for moving
Ask
a
them
bill
if
forward.
they want co-sponsors on their bills.
Right. Okay. So moving on to another category here, and Vinay, I'll throw this one your way. And I don't know if you've heard things in this field, but I had a state representative for like over a decade who I hated. We had a tough relationship with each other, but he would always tell me that he doesn't hear much from his district, that there's not enough people asking him about Medicare for all or pushing him on it. And I, of course, know this not to be true. We ran like a non-binding ballot initiative in his district that showed like 85% of his constituents support it. But it would be like you haven't organized enough people type of response. Have you ever got that, or how would you react to that?
Well, thankfully, like the nature of my job is I'm walking into the building with receipts.
With people, right?
Like I have
Yeah.
5 people with me with personal stories, or like we just did a Twitter storm and or we sent a sign-on letter with like 500 people or something like that. So, I mean, that would have to be just a completely bad faith argument if they were to say that to us.
Right.
Like we're like walking in disproving that notion. But it's also like, even if that weren't the case, it's still, after someone tells their personal story, if they can't, afford insulin, it's very hard for them to say like, well, not enough people
Right.
are in that situation
Right.
for me to do anything about it. It's okay, how many people need to be sick in your office before you do something? So usually like they have to use more like dog whistle terminology and evasive tactics. They can't just say like, I'm sorry, you're not sick enough, I can't do anything about it. They'll often just like pretend to care. That's usually what they'll do if they're not to be too cynical. Some of them definitely do care, but the ones who are not trying to actually take any action, they will put on a brave face and be compassionate and write a few notes in their book, and then kind of hope they never have to see you again.
One thing that I've found, like one way that this sort of shows up is when they kind of dismiss you as the usual suspects. Have you gotten that? Like, oh, you're just a bunch of crazy communists and that's why you're here or whatever, but it's just the usual suspects, just the same people or whatever. Do you ever get that, Vinay?
I do, particularly with healthcare, because I think like everyone, it's, both parties, everyone gets sick, right? Everyone experiences difficulties with the healthcare system. So they'll always have that line where, like, especially Democrats will say like, oh, of course, I want as many people with health insurance as possible. I want to help. Like they always say like, I believe in your values. Like I share your values. No one would say the opposite. Then they will always just add a qualifier of, it's not winnable, or we can't pay for it, or like we're not quite there yet. Or we have to take incremental steps. So like, I guess there's an implication there, like what you're asking for is too much, too soon, like you're too extreme. Like, of course I want to like make your drugs cheaper. Of course I want to help you in any way I can. I'm just, my hands are tied right now. So yeah, it's usually saying like you're, I guess naive maybe is the way I would say it. Like you're asking for things that are not possible. Yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me of, this is another category that I've run into a few times, especially when you have a legislator who you're actually running a campaign to get them to support the bill. You are generating calls, you're generating things. I don't know if you've ever had this, but I had a senator who would tell me that we were going about it the wrong way, trying to get her, like how we win her support. Like you just don't do these things. You don't, there's angry constituents who are yelling at her aides and really
it's not polite.
Exactly. And they're like, this is not how it's done. This is not how, they would tell us we're hurting our own cause, essentially, by running an active campaign. But
yeah, and if I can add to that, I've heard like more moderate Dems say, like, again, like I agree with your values, but like there are other people in the Senate who play that role of pushing that like, extreme agenda. And it's like my role, like this is them talking, it's my role to be like in the middle so I can compromise. Like it's my lane to be like a moderate. I'm actually curious, Egan, what you think of that, because I don't know. I mean, I guess there could be some, sort of truth to that, but I think most of it is just an excuse to not take bold action, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it sort of dovetails with something that I feel like I hear frequently is that I want to work on bipartisan solutions, or I'm trying to get something similar through committee, and I feel like it also really ramped up around both the 2016 and the 2020 elections, which was like throwing in like a public option or Medicare for all who want it, sort of milquetoast stuff.
Whatever happened to the public option? I haven't heard about it. I don't know if y'all have.
It passed. And actually, all the problems were solved. Sorry, you didn't get the memo.
Well, and that's what's interesting, because I think some of them do genuinely believe that, and I think some staffers also buy into it as well. But I've found it can be helpful to help them understand both. That it's sort of like Medicare for All has really pulled the discussion to the left and has really sort of made space in the middle to have some of these discussions about interim things, maybe things that we can fix in the shorter term, or things that an administration can do, that there's value. But having that sort of leading edge, sort of that cutting edge of Medicare for All really sort of pushes the envelope and is what's giving some of that space to do some of the bipartisan stuff where there may be some tinkering. Because if we're not building towards something consistent and good and useful like Medicare for All, we're really missing the point in any of the reforms we're making.
Yeah, and I wanted to, before we moved on, I wanted to highlight Vinay's point that if you come in telling a personal story about how you've been impacted, it really diffuses a lot of these kind of dismissive things.
Yeah.
So do that. What you don't want to do is to just go in with generic talking points, policy arguments, and things like that. That's when you really make yourself open to a lot of these kind of dismissals, I think. So
It's true. If you try to take that intellectual, I have to say one of my favorite legislative visits in my many years of doing this was it was actually on immigration. There were some anti-immigrant bills that were up in the Massachusetts State House, and so we went with immigrant youth and also clergy, and we went into every legislator's office and we talked to them about the issue. Immigrant youth shared their stories, and then the clergy asked the aides to pray with us for justice for immigrant families. And so, all these conservative folks who are like, sitting there like, oh, God and country, they have to say, no, I'm not going to pray with you for immigrant youth. Or they actually have to sit there and like pray for justice. And yeah, again, that personal moment, that human moment, that's when you get them, I think.
Right. Make it really hard for your legislator to be dismissive asshole to you is the one important lesson here. And Egan, you were kind of getting at this a little bit, but another big category of evasion is that Medicare for All is not politically feasible. It's not happening this session. So we get a lot of language around that, like I'm prioritizing other things, or I'm focused on other types of healthcare that can pass. How do you usually respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a tough one because it can also help you understand sort of where they're thinking. So if somebody does go in that direction, I usually try to sort of draw them out, sort of what are their priorities, what are sort of the specific things, and then take those back to Medicare for All. And so, you're talking like if somebody's talking about, hospital concerns about hospital consolidation or losing hospitals in their district, taking it back to Medicare for All and highlighting under Medicare for All, we would have global budgets that would make sure whether it's an urban hospital or rural hospital, sort of wherever it is, that it has the funding that it needs to provide care for its community. And so, taking the different pieces of what their priorities are and sort of, because I think one of the things that you'll find, especially with the offices that are sort of in the middle space, they might be Medicare for All curious, but they're not sort of quite ready to go there. Is that there are pieces that they didn't know were in there. And so as you're sort of highlighting them, they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like in some of their pet issues, because Medicare for All is such a big bill and is sort of the leading edge of progressive stuff on so many different aspects of health policy, there's going to be some pieces that they like, and there might even be some pieces of bills that they've supported elsewhere. And so, if they start talking about that, it could be worth, following back up with them saying, hey, I noticed you also co-sponsored this or are sponsoring this, here's a piece that's similar in Medicare for All. And sometimes that can lead to, more thorough conversations or more nuanced conversations that staff can appreciate.
Yeah. And it's not like co-sponsoring a bill is like such a time commitment that they just can't do that and all their other priorities, right? I mean,
it's an online form. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think that's one of the important things when you were talking about sort of doing it the wrong way is for some offices, the point is to make it easier for them to just say yes than to keep saying no. That if they're like, if I just say yes, I don't have to see this person probably again for 6 months.
Right. So I'm nearing the end of my categories, but you all might have experiences I haven't covered here. The last one that I get sometimes from certain offices is that they will nitpick the bill. Right. They'll pick out little things here and there, and especially since the Medicare for All bills usually don't have financing in them, they don't have like all the tax structures that go into it. We'll sometimes get that from legislators saying, I can't sign on to it. It doesn't have the financing in it yet. Vinay or Egan, do you get this one, or have you had to deal with this sort of thing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned the financing. I feel like that's actually the number one thing we get. It's always
really interesting.
You can't pay for that. Like, how are we going to pay for that? It's not possible.
Right.
And anyone who says that to you is either, ill-informed or they're just lying, because Medicare for All, as we know, is cost saving, right? I haven't looked at the recent numbers, but I think I remember seeing, estimates that there's like $1 trillion in administrative costs that would be saved if we transition to a universal system. So if they're saying that to you, they either don't know what they're talking about, and hopefully we can teach them and coach them up, or they're just trying to get you out of the room and they're lying to you. Of course, we can pay for it. I think the ones who are saying that in bad faith are basically saying these are not people I want to invest in, right? I see this all the time in combating the overdose epidemic. We do a lot of work trying to get investments in harm reduction, and again, most of those bills we're asking for are also cost saving. So I think particularly when we get that argument in that realm, it's basically conservative folks saying I don't want to invest money in people who use drugs. And they won't phrase it as people who use drugs. They'll say more stigmatizing terms than that. So yeah, in terms of a budget being a value statement, I think when you get that argument, you're talking to people who don't think your lives are worth saving. And again, it's when I'm walking into the room or on a Zoom call, I'm with our affiliates, our directly impacted folks who are telling personal stories. So I mean, if you're going to bring out that argument, you're going to have a tense conversation with our folks for sure.
Right.
Renee, I would be terrified if I were an asshole legislator in my office.
Yeah.
I would be very scared. I think that your calm demeanor combined with your answer for everything is really it must be really intimidating for folks. I think that's great.
But you raised another important point, Vinay, which is this issue of when tension arises in these meetings. Since legislators and their aides deal with this all the time, I found that their capacity for dealing with tension is usually pretty high, but activists often are not. It feels really uncomfortable. It's oh, they're mad at us. We're ruining an interpersonal relationship. They feel bad, pushing on an issue. But I think, so I do think part of the training for folks going in, sort of learning to do this, is you also have to kind of up your threshold for tension within the room, and not think of it as a interpersonal relationship in the sense of making friends out in the normal world. I mean, you are building a relationship, but ultimately you're asking them to do something that they might not want to do, but they have to do the right thing. So
right. And two thoughts while you're saying that is, I mean, if you're doing a lobby visit and there's tension, that's definitely their fault, right? I mean,
right.
Constituents coming and talking to the representatives, how democracy is supposed to work.
Right.
So it shouldn't be a super heated discussion.
Good point.
And if it is, it's probably because someone isn't doing their job, and it definitely isn't us if we're traveling all the way to talk to you. And then I know this is a question coming up later, but if you're bird dogging or you're talking, a lobby visit, in theory, it should be a casual conversation. But if it is going to be heated and we're prepared for that, that's not a bad thing either, right? Because if in those contexts you're engaging in protest, direct action, civil disobedience, the discomfort is the point there, right? Some people are oh, I support protests, but not when it inconveniences folks. And I'm no, that's the point. It's supposed to inconvenience
right.
folks.
Right.
So depends on the context. If it's a lobby visit, I would tell people you're telling your story. You have no reason, to feel tense about that. And if it's civil disobedience, I'm well, yeah, that's why we're here. We're
right.
We're bringing the discomfort to their doorstep until they, do something about it.
Great
Comforting
point.
the afflictable and afflicting the comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that if sort of some of the discomfort comes from if folks are in meetings, don't feel like you have to have the answer to everything that the staffers say. And as sort of Ben was talking about, there will be a lot of nitpicking points. Vinay referenced sort of being too expensive. That was number one on my list as well. I have a list of 25 things, and that's a very common one. And so don't feel like you have to solve it in the room, because it's not sort of your performance in that room that's going to sort of be the thing that gets them on or ensures that they're never going to get on. That it is important that you are sort of thinking about it as a relationship, and that you are, pushing this office to do the right thing. You're helping them be on the right side of history. And so sometimes it may feel oh, I don't know exactly how many millions would be saved or something like that, but don't get stuck on that. Really sort of, you can even sort of take a step back and say, oh, that's something that we're interested in as well, but we don't have that today. We can get back to you with some of those numbers or some resources that you might find helpful. Other sort of technical ones is I'll find some offices start really getting into things like wait times, and they'll sort of vaguely refer to Canada or the UK or the EU.
Right. Or
And
Vermont or Colorado, or we get
Mhm.
all that now. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
that or they get really hung up on things like, the end to private insurance, or
Mhm.
that they want people to be able to choose their insurer, as if
Right.
people really have that choice now.
Right.
When all evidence indicates that people's
Mhm.
attempts to pick the right insurer almost
Mhm.
never happens except by the roll of a dice. And so it's really about sort of taking what they're saying and sort of turning it towards something positive. That it's like, if you want people, your constituents, to have choice, it should be the choice of provider. Like the choice of insurer, you're trading one bad faith actor for another bad faith death, but
Mhm.
your choice of
Mhm.
provider is crucial and something that we just don't have in our current system. So if you feel caught up, definitely feel free to sort of offer additional, assistance later, or email them different information, or sort of try to just turn it back to your overall message of why Medicare for All matters, or why it matters
Mhm.
to you, and really go back to your personal story.
Right. And
Yeah.
people can always come to any of our organizations if they want help with the
Yes.
tough policy questions like cost and savings, all that stuff. You can ask
Yeah.
Public Citizen, CPD, or Healthcare Now to help you out with
Yes,
that.
definitely.
But what we always tell people is like, actually, you don't have to be a policy expert. That's not your job,
Mhm.
right? If you're a person who's being victimized by our healthcare system, and you live in our healthcare system and you're getting fucked every day,
Mhm.
that's actually all the experience you need to be able to speak to this topic.
Right.
And so, yeah, just the fact that you want this law passed is actually enough of a reason for them to sit there and listen to you. So,
Mhm.
yeah, we try to emphasize that.
Mm-hmm.
But this leads us into something, one of the responses that I think is the most frustrating, which is I call it the Ted Cruz. It's basically whenever you try to reach your legislator in order to ask them a tough question, they're in Cancun. And so, like, I mean, basically, we know from experience, you can just make these calls and email them all day long, and some of them just won't respond and won't give any answer whatsoever. What the fuck are people supposed to do then?
Can I jump in here, Egan? Is that cool?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Well, for that one, this is where the fun starts, I would say. In that at CPD, like we and our affiliates, we love bird dogging.
Mhm.
We formed, I don't know if y'all have heard of Bird Dog Nation, but CPD and Housing Works, when Trump was trying to repeal the ACA in 2017, we brought a bunch of folks to town halls across the country. Then eventually we flooded
Mhm.
Senate offices in DC, and we just got folks telling their personal stories and bird dogging. And if folks aren't familiar with that term, it typically just means going to a town hall and asking a question in a very strategic way to get people to publicly respond to your issue. But to your question, like when it isn't that easy to just go to a town hall or get someone on the phone or an office, sometimes we've gotten really creative. Like, so you gave the example of Ted Cruz flying to Cancun. Like, honestly, if that's who I wanted to speak to, I would figure out when his plane was landing in DC.
Right.
We've done that. We've camped out in the airports over there,
Hmm.
looked at the
Amazing.
schedules and figured out when they're gonna land, and we have people posted at all the terminals.
Wow.
And then we'll see Mitch McConnell get off his plane, and we'll just walk him to his car. Like, he's got nowhere else to go. He can run if he wants to. But if he runs, I don't think it's going to look great on video for him. So we just calmly walk him to his car and ask about a bill or ask about something, get someone telling a story. There's definitely I mean, you have to walk and talk and tell your story and have someone, recording the video. But yeah, CPD does a lot of bird dog trainings. If anyone here is interested, if you get 15 people in a room, we can send someone out and do a training. But yeah, so we've done it in airports. We've done that in the tunnels underneath Congress. So folks are familiar with the area. There's tunnels. All the
Awesome.
you can just camp out there. My former boss, Ana Maria Archila, famously, bird dogged Jeff Flake in an elevator during the Kavanaugh protests. I mean, and all those are examples of individual people telling an individual story and asking a question. And in some cases, it could control a news cycle for a day or 2 days. In some cases, it can convince someone to vote a certain way. It has all kinds of impacts. So yeah, those are pretty fun, little expeditions to plan. If that sounds fun to anyone, let me know.
Yeah.
And I feel like, Egan, I don't know if this is your experience too, but this became an epidemic during the pandemic, the legislators avoiding their constituents altogether. And at least the reports we get from our activists is it became very, very hard, especially during like the height of the pandemic, to even get someone on the phone or get an email reply or to find anyone. So I think things are easing up a little bit though now. So
Yeah. The Capitol is opening back up, and so actually bringing groups to meet with legislators is easier. Yeah, it was tough to get sort of Zoom collective Zoom calls. It was something that can happen if you are having a particularly hard time reaching out to sort of one of our groups. We may be able to sort of get a direct line or be able to help you identify sort of folks in your community that are also working on this, and you guys can come together. And then it may be a little harder for them if it's sort of a collective ask on behalf of nurses and doctors and people who have experienced healthcare challenges in their district. All of a sudden it's much tougher. And if one of our groups is also saying like, hey, we would like to join as well, all of a sudden if they're feeling sort of different pressure, it may be a little different than just sort of calling up and asking for a meeting. But I think it is getting a little easier overall, so folks may have a better experience.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, when we train activists to do like grassroots lobbying, we say you want to have a campaign of escalating tactics. So you start with private, behind closed doors, talking politely with the aides and with the legislators and asking them to do the right thing and giving them a chance to ask questions and all that stuff. And then only if they say no do you escalate to kind of public pressure. But as Vinay was saying, if they want to skip the polite behind the scenes phase, then by all means, right, we should just jump to public pressure campaigns, right? So that's great. So the last thing I wanted to ask from both of you before we wrap this up, and I really appreciate all your thoughts on this, is I feel like we get a lot of folks, especially this time of year when we're asking people to make a call to the legislator, who are just so demoralized about the chances, their perceived chances of moving their legislator. Obviously with Republicans, but also with many Democrats, they just feel like they've tried over and over again. Nothing has worked. And they're like, this person will never, ever support Medicare for all. That we can only dream of like replacing them someday. Vinay, what would you say to folks like that who just feel kind of too demoralized to take action?
Pep talk time.
Yeah, no, I could say a lot of things, but I'll try to be brief. But yeah, we get this question a lot from folks thinking like, I don't know if I really have any power here or any influence. Like, I don't know if this is for me. And like, I would say like, you're the only one with the power. I think people have like a misunderstanding of like where power resides in Washington. Like they often think like, these senators and presidents are like benevolent and they walk in and they do amazing things. And I'm like, that's just not true. Like we're the ones with the power, and we're the ones who push them to do like, a fraction of what we're actually asking. Yeah. So like any great legislative accomplishment you can think of, we often like, hero worship like the president or like a big activist or someone, but like all those people, there are like thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the ground who work to make that happen, telling their stories, organizing in communities. So like, you're the only ones who can make this happen. So anyone listening to this, I think Jillian said it earlier, another hesitancy some people have about like going to bird dogging or telling their stories, like, well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert, I don't know the law, but you're all an expert on your own personal story. That's all you need to be in order to do this work. Just if you're impacted by our healthcare system, as we all are, then you can be doing this work. And to give like some more like specific examples, like every candidate, every senator, every representative like has a staffer counting how many times an issue comes up. So like when we do bird dog trainings, we talk about it as putting little stones on a scale. So if you go to like a town hall and like 6 different people ask, Medicare for all questions, that staffer is going to, have that tally, and they're going to go to their back room later and be like, hey, like we need a better answer for this. Like, what are we doing about healthcare? Like people keep asking these questions. It's the same thing with phone calls and emails. And I think Ben mentioned escalating tactics. Sending emails, writing petitions is great. Hopping on phone calls is great. Lobby visits and bird dogging is great. And like you get more escalating towards like civil disobedience and that kind of thing. And the great thing about having all of those tools in the toolbox is you can do whatever is accessible to you, whatever is safe to you, whatever you're comfortable with. But like whoever is listening to this, there is something you can do in the toolbox right now. Like everyone has a role to play on this team. So yeah, people listen to this, you definitely have the power. And yeah, it's not like a home run derby where you just get Medicare for all, like, on the first swing. Like it's a long grueling baseball game with that goes into the 16th inning with singles and singles. I don't know why I'm using baseball. That's my least favorite sport.
I stopped
But anyway.
understanding what you were talking about.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean,
I would definitely say whoever's listening to this, please join us. Contact me, contact Egan, contact Ben, Jillian. We'll plug you into action. We have people all across the country who want to do this with you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, the baseball, because it is getting at sort of that incremental state pressure that is sometimes needed. That even if you're feeling like your particular rep is absolutely useless on this, the other folks in your district, in your state, there's always base building to be done so that we have the power to push. Even if you don't think your rep's going to be gotten rid of anytime soon, there might be a Senate seat that appeals to them, and all of a sudden somebody that seemed like they were going to be in this House seat forever, they move on to something else, and now it's an open seat. And so if you had built sort of the infrastructure, if you're working on resolutions, you're working on bird dogging, you're building connections to different folks in your community that are affected with different healthcare issues, all of a sudden you have a new opportunity to really push, and you may find some fruitful to escalate. All of a sudden, I mean, the COVID-19 really sort of changed a lot of folks' perspectives on healthcare.
Mhm.
Some of them still take a ton of money from bad people in the healthcare sector, but all of a sudden it's easier to get people to talk about their stories. People have been differentially affected throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and so getting those folks connected with other activists and telling their stories and building sort of that grassroots pressure and doing the organizing that will bear fruit, even if it's not always easy. And so the other good thing is that it also generates friendships and a sense of community at a time where we often feel very disaffected from our neighbors. And so this getting involved in the Medicare for All movement is valuable, even if you feel like your rep is useless. But the beers that you share after that lobbying visit are going to be all the sweeter.
I knew you would end with beers. I love it, Egan.
That's so galvanizing. I love that. I love
I
both
know.
you guys. Y'all are great.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for me, when you've seen reps who you never thought you would get on board,
Yes.
and you get them on board, it forever changes your perception of what's possible. But I know not everyone has the privilege of seeing lots and lots of campaigns, so they might not have had that experience. But trust me, it can be done. None of these reps are ungettable with enough community.
Yeah, I've been shocked by the times, and sometimes you don't see the flip coming. Like there have been some of the CPD videos where they just got somebody, like that person on that stage in that moment was like something clicked in their brain, and now they're way out ahead of their staff, and their staff who have given us all this BS are just like, well, he's on now, nothing I can do about it. And also times where they just feel the pressure that they've enough folks have reached out to them, they're seeing sort of reading the tea leaves, they're thinking about things in a different way, and they're just like, you know what, it's easier to be on it than to face these questions at my next public event.
Easier to say yes than no. I like that philosophy. That's good. I also want to just give a quick shout out, because we're talking about building power, and it looks like on the live, commenting on the live stream on YouTube, we have Camplicated. That's the username. But this is one of our comrades from New Jersey DSA, where they're trying to pass a prescription drug cap bill. And they're right now working on lobbying all their sponsors. And Camplicated says, obviously still want Medicare for all, but this is where we're at. And you know what? That's great too, right? Just the action of working on this, like Ian was saying, right? That itself helps to build the movement. That's awesome. So
And also, speaking of movement building, I want to put a little plug in for the upcoming 2023 Medicare for All Strategy Conference. It's coming up in about a month. It's going to be the week of April 17th to 23rd. Actually, a lot of things that have been talked about here, the campaign work you can do workshops on. So CPD is going to do a workshop on bird dogging, and Public Citizen is going to do a workshop on municipal resolutions. You can register for the conference at medicareforall23.sked.com. That's sked is SCHED.com. It's on the screen if you're watching the live stream, and if you're listening to the audio, it will have a link in the show notes. And I want to thank our podcast team. Our podcast manager is Angelique Davis, our researcher for this episode, and her last episode as our intern was Pimsri Rajanaporn. Our show notes writer was Jerry Katz, and our audio editor was Christian Brandt. So do not forget to like this episode, subscribe to the Medicare for All podcast on your favorite platform. And this show is a project of the Healthcare Now Education Fund. So if you want to support our work, you can also donate at our website, healthcare-now.org. Thanks so much, Egan and Vinay. It was great talking with you and sharing your insights.
Thanks for having us.
Stay
Bye,
safe
y'all.
and